Hi, fantasy fiction fans, and welcome to Myth and Magic, a fantasy writer's kit bag. I'm fantasy writer Neil Mack, the author of Moondog and the Reed Leopard, and I want to share my love of folklore, local history and nature mythology with writers and creatives like you on my regular podcasts. It's designed with fellow indie publishers and writers in mind, but all fans of fantasy fiction are very welcome to join in. In my fantasy writer's kit bag, writers, artists and creatives will find lots of ideas and discussion about things such as potions, dark arts, fabulous creatures, folktale studies, nature lore, and the interesting history behind the myth and magic that underpins our understanding of the fictional universe. Happy Ēostre, fantasy fiction fans. Ēostre, E-O-S-T-R-E, or Ēostre. Who was Ēostre? Well, Ēostre, maybe we should say Ēostre, from whom we get our word Easter, was originally an Indo-European dawn goddess, also known as a daughter of heaven, and she was the reluctant bringer of light. She was possibly connected with the better known and far more powerful Astarte, who was a chief goddess and a female divinity of some of the world's most ancient civilizations, including the Canaanites and the Phoenicians and even the Mesopotamian cultures. Astarte, which even sounds as similar to Ēostre or Ostaria or Ēostre, was connected with fertility amongst other things, and she was associated with the morning or the evening star. Notice that star also sounds similar to Astarte. The Hebrews said that Astarte represented the productive power of nature, which seems to fit in with the general idea of Ēostre or Ēostre being a bringer of light amongst the darkness. Later it said that Ēostre became a popular Anglo-Saxon goddess, though there's scant evidence to support that claim. But according to the 8th century monk, Bede, and although there's some controversy about his claims, he says that Ēostre gave her name to a springtime month that was later changed by the early Christian church into what they called the Paschal month, P-A-S-C-H-A-L, though he suggested that this month was previously known by the pagans as Ēostre, in whose honour the various feasts during that period were celebrated. Though certainly, and before Christianity, there must have been a spring-like fertility goddess, and she was most likely connected to prosperity and to growth, and she was probably interwoven into the folk memory of the people from the memory of Astarte. And in Europe, or certainly in North Europe, but most of Europe, she would most likely have been celebrated at the time of the spring equinox, because she brought with her, at that time, a sense of renewal and of rebirth after death and resurrection from the darkness of winter. The Christian festival, which we now call Easter, which falls in April or at the end of March, seems to mysteriously coincide with the period known as Ostermonat in German tradition, and this tends to support the idea that the feast celebrates, at least to some extent, the idea of a Germanic goddess, Ēostre. In Old Norse tradition, by the way, Ēostri, which is another similar word, A-U-S-T-R-I, is depicted as a dwarf who rises from the east. There are 4 dwarfs, each rise from a different compass point, but Ēostri rises from the east. So Ēostri shares similarities with the dawn deity that Bede described as Ēostre. And in neo-paganism, Ostara, which is very similar to the German tradition of Ostermonat, Ostara, O-S-T-A-R-A, is on the modern Wiccan wheel of the year, and Ostar is the 21st of March. So, who is Ēostre? Who knows? She probably comes from the idea of Astarte. She's possibly an Indo-European dawn goddess and the daughter of heaven. She's the person who reluctantly brings light into the world. So, what is a king? At the first Easter, Jesus of Nazareth was accused of claiming to be a king, which seemed to be a bit of a big thing. So he was dragged before the king of the Jews, which was King Herod, who apparently didn't have the power or authority to deal with him, so he was sent back to a politician, the political governor of Judea, who had the required power to sentence him, and he was crucified. So in the Easter story, we understand that a king was very powerful, but not that powerful. Not as powerful, perhaps, as a junior politician. So a king was subservient to a junior grade Roman official, but was powerful. It's a bit of a confusing situation. And it's much the same now. The three world superpowers, the United States of America, Russia and China, they don't have kings. They're run by political appointees. And some European nations do have kings, but these kings are subordinate to fascist bureaucrats in the European Union offices. I live in a true monarchy in England. It's not a constitutional monarchy, but neither is it an absolute monarchy, and I'll come to both those definitions in a moment. Yet our Queen seems to be junior in power and authority, junior to a youngish and relatively recently elected Prime Minister. So what is a king? Why are they very, very powerful and also very, very, very unpowerful? It's a bit confusing. The problems that are associated with the title of king, in other words, the problems that they have power and authority, but they can't use it, probably goes right back to the very start, right back into prehistory, right back to the tribal societies of the Stone Age. Because back then, those tribes that lived inside an area which we now call a nation were really just large family groups of people. They were groups of people who had a common family bond between them. Almost always they existed within a much larger nation state, or in some cases a colonial state. So those tribes had to appoint a tribal chief to represent their tribe or their family group at the higher place. And it's not just in European Stone Age civilization this happened either. It also happened in the Americas and in Africa and in Oceania and in Southeast Asia. All these continents had their tribal chiefships. And many of these tribal chieftains were anointed and crowned as kings. The word king is actually English. It's an English term, and it's derived from the Anglo-Saxon word kyning or syning, C-Y-N-I-N-G. But in the context of classical antiquity, the word king can be translated into Latin as rex, R-E-X, or into Greek as archon, A-R-C-H-O-N. But since neither the Greek or the Roman political systems depended on kings, neither of these words, rex and archon, are particularly helpful for us when we're trying to understand the power and authority of kings. In fact, archon can be roughly translated as meaning club leader, which sounds a pretty lowly civil service rank if you ask me. And if that sounds junior grade, then some translations make archon sound even worse. Some translations of archon define it as master of the table. And rex, in Roman Latin, actually means chief magistrate. But ancient Rome did once have an absolute monarch. It was when Rome first started out as a concept. And if you wanted to find out more about the start of Rome, you probably need to listen to the special Rome shows that I did earlier this year. Rome and Greeks aside, we're probably better off looking at the definition of what an absolute monarch is, and it's called absolutism, if we were to discover why some kings are more powerful than others and why mere tribal chieftains came to be anointed and crowned as kings. In order to do this successfully, I will need to do a quote, and it's a quote that I've used before from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And it's a comedy quote, but it's fitting right now, and you'll find out why in a moment. So here goes. King Arthur. The Lady of the Lake, her arm clad in the purest shimmering samite, held aloft Excalibur from the bosom of the water, signifying by divine providence that I, Arthur, was to carry Excalibur, and that is why I am your king. To which Dennis replied, Listen, strange women laying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government. Supreme executive power derived from a mandate from the masses, not from some farcical aquatic ceremony. You can't expect to wield supreme executive power just cause some watery tart threw a sword at you. It's a bit of comedy, and although it's silly, it's very helpful because it's exactly right. The king here, King Arthur, the king of the Britons, is an absolute monarch, and he holds his supreme autocratic authority over his subjects, which means he's basically free from earthly authority, although perhaps his authority is restricted by custom and local religious morals. But he holds that supreme autocratic authority, and he gets legitimacy from it from a higher power. In this case, the higher power is the Lady of the Lake. So his power comes from a supernatural source. This power, coming from a supernatural force, is known as the divine right of kings. The idea stems from a metaphysical framework in which the king, or in some cases the queen, is pre-selected as an heir prior to his or her birth. By pre-selecting the king's physical manifestation, the populace have decided amongst themselves to actively, rather than passively, hand over the metaphysical selection of a king's soul to God, or in some cases to the pantheon of gods. So in other words, the soul that will inhabit the body of a king and will therefore rule over them has been handed over to a supernatural entity to choose. So, seen in this context, the divine right of the king originates as a metaphysical act of humility and submission by the mass of the people, i.e. those who want to be reigned over. Humility and submission to a supernatural creator deity, a supreme being we might call God. And in some cultures, the king is also called the Son of Heaven. Now, going back to the Jesus of Nazareth story, is this why the Judeans were upset when Jesus of Nazareth started to claim to be a king? Because only a king could be a king if he has the divine right to be one. And that is why, of course, the crowning of a king appears to be, when we look at it, a religious ceremony. So, for example, it's often, or virtually always, held in some kind of religious place, a big church. It's held with a high-ranking religious leader, normally a bishop, and they sit on the throne and they're crowned by the church people. Of course, now that you've brought a god, or the god, into the equation, it perhaps implies that only a divine authority can judge a king, and any attempt to depose or dethrone or restrict a king's authority, a king who you've decided, don't forget, has absolute powers over you, will run contrary to the god's will and might even be held to be sacrilegious. And this is why our English monarch, Elizabeth II, has the words, by the grace of God, which is Dei Gratia, or DG, it's abbreviated to DG, after her name. And it's because she reigns by divine right. And that means she reigns by the grace of God, much like King Arthur once did. Some ruling kings went further, and they said that they had the backing of heavenly powers, as if they knew the god or the gods on first-name terms, while others went further still and claimed they were personally related to one of the gods, and some even claimed to be in the same family or were divine beings themselves. So kings don't just have earthly powers, they often have spiritual authority too. King Richard I of England, who lived 1157 to 1199, famously announced, and I quote, "I am born in a rank which recognises no superior but God, to whom alone I am responsible for my actions." And Richard I of England used the French motto, Dieu est mon droit, Dieu est mon droit, which translates as God and my right. It was a clever bit of wordplay, which at face value means that his power comes from his right hand, in other words, his sword hand. But it also means his right, R-I-G-H-T, to be king, the king who's chosen by God. And this motto is still used, by the way, by the British monarchy to this very day, Dieu est mon droit. As a fantasy fiction writer, you will probably be most interested in kingship within a medieval type setting. So you'll be inspired by the kings in the Game of Thrones books, for example, or the kings found in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. "I serve no man," said Aragorn, for example. Although Ned Stark was probably one of those tribal chieftains that I mentioned earlier, because he was Lord of Winterfell, and he was not anointed as a king like Robert Baratheon was, who himself, by the way, was a fat usurper, so his citizens downplayed his absolute right to rule over them. In settings such as these, the king is often seen as God's vice-regent upon earth, and therefore he's subject to no inferior power. This type of king is an absolute monarch in every sense. He holds absolute power over all other men in his realm. He holds the power of life over death. Now, if you're going to have kingship in your novel, try to instill your kingly character with this kind of divine grace. Explore the problems that this will bring. This kind of sanctified existence must bring problems to a mere woman-born man, because he's not a deity, he's a man. As a weak human, he will be subject to various impulses, but must never allow those earthborn impulses to diminish his claim to the divine power. He must at all times be seen to impart strength and must be able to endure incredible trials and resist incredible temptations, all because he's associated with, if not directly related to, the divine power of the universe. He'll also act as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He'll be the supreme diplomat and the head of any government. But how does he do all of these things yet continue to be just a man? So you'll want to show your king to be strong and wise and powerful, but he'll still be dependent on the base-born men who put him there on the throne in the first place. So he is high enough to wield the high sword of state, by the grace of God, Dieu est mon droit. He can take away a man's life if he wants to. You know that Henry VIII and Elizabeth I used to write execution warrants. They were quite happy to execute people. Yet he is patient and he is modest enough to know that and to acknowledge that earthborn men put him there on the throne in the first place. And if they did that, then they could also take his power away, like they did with Charles I. So it must be quite a challenge to inherit such extreme and unquestionable power as a birthright, but to have all of your greatness tempered and blunted by the unwashed common folk who gather around your throne to adore you and to serve you. Much earlier I said I'd define a constitutional monarchy for you, but of course this must come after the idea of an absolute monarchy, which we've just discussed. The idea of a constitutional monarchy is a much more seriously watered down version of kingship, and it makes more sense in a modern world. A constitutional monarch is one in which there's a sovereign king, and the king exercises authority in accordance with a set of written or unwritten rules known as the Constitution. These rules, the Constitution, normally grant discretionary powers to the king. Since Britain has no constitution, and this is a confusing subject that I don't want to go into right now, but suffice to say it has no constitution, then this means that our monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, is more absolute than she is constitutional. Some will argue that point, but I'm telling you now that she's more an absolute monarch than she is a constitutional monarch. That argument is for another day, but there are proper, watered-down constitutional kings all over the place. You can find them in Morocco. They're not always called kings, by the way. Sometimes they're called emirs or sheikhs. But Morocco, Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, Spain, Belgium, Sweden and Japan. Often these kings retain no formal authority at all, but they still act as a head of state. And if you really want the best example of watered-down constitutional monarchy, think about these kings. Two states, Malaysia and Cambodia, have gone one step further and they actually elect their kings. They elect their kings like other republics might elect their president. So, what is a king? This week I wanted to discuss atmosphere and wanted to talk about creating atmosphere in fantasy fiction. Atmosphere comes from the ancient Greek atmos, A-T-M-O-S, which means a vapour or sphere, and that vapour or sphere is in the globe or in the world. And here I'm talking about the sensory qualities of creating atmosphere in your writing instead of a purely scientific or topological idea of creating an atmosphere for a planet. So, for example, if you are a science fiction writer, and I'm not talking about creating an atmosphere for the planet in your science fiction novel, I'm talking about the sensory qualities of creating atmosphere in writing. Philosophers have tried to describe the attributes of atmosphere in a systematic way, and here, in my own words, are some of the vital characteristics of atmospheres. So try, if you can, to bring atmosphere into your storytelling by using one or more of the following characteristics. And here they are. Number 1, light. In the scene that you're depicting, is it serene? Is it stimulating? Is it gloomy? Is it festive? Is it creepy? What mood does the light in your scene bring? What mood does it bring? Number 2, objects. The objects that are placed in the description can have an intangible and tangible characteristic. For example, a well-placed object can provoke an idea in a reader's mind, or it can provoke a memory, or bring a nuanced colour, or smell, or texture. So carefully place your objects. And what objects are they? Think about them before you put them in. Air. Air brings sound, and it brings heat, and it brings odour to your scene. And you can also add solidity and literalness to nebulous notions, for example, stress and tension and fatigue, if you bring those in with the air. So a cold or damp air might make somebody shiver. Warm, unusually warm air might make somebody sweat. Materials. Different from objects, because materials is what objects are made from and what your scene is built of. Materials will offer texture, colour, temperature and tone, and they will create a vivid environment. So if you were describing a castle, you'd have cold stone walls. If you were describing a Bible, which is the object, the material it's made of might be cold, clammy leather. Sound. Even empty spaces produce sound through stillness. Sounds evoke emotional and sensual responses in your readership, and they also help to define and consolidate memory and familiarity in your characters. So, for example, if every time they pass the church steeple they hear the cackle of a black crow in a tree, and you remind the reader of that 2 or 3 times in the story, it will start to bring atmosphere. And the last in my list of important ways that you can bring atmosphere is a bit more difficult. It's called the genius loci. In the classical period, the Roman period, a genius loci was the protective spirit of a place. In religious iconography, the genius loci are often depicted as mythical figures or creatures. It is the numinous spirit of a place, and in the modern sense, the notion of the spirit of a place is often most likely used instead of an imaginary guardian spirit. So, for example, the spirit of a bomb shelter might be dispossession and time delay and uncertainty. Or people, when they visit Auschwitz, the concentration camp used in the Second World War by the Nazis, they often say that they've experienced, when they visited, the feelings of heartbreak and of emptiness and of distress. The genius loci of a graveyard that's situated on a windy moor is obviously different from the genius loci of an abandoned amusement arcade that's situated on a rundown housing estate. Both will probably have a kind of numinous spirit that haunts them. They will probably both have some kind of protection, a spiritual protection. And they'll certainly have memories that are kind of etched into the materials that have constructed those. And that feeling that you get in a graveyard, or that feeling you get in an abandoned amusement arcade, is the genius loci. So try to pin down and try to describe the feeling of the genius loci in your next important scene. Wildflower of the week. This week, the violet. Violets were my wife's grandmother's favourite flower. She recalls picking them in the springtime to take to her own mother. So this is a tradition which goes back over 100 years. Each year, when we see the wild violets that emerge in our own garden here along the Thames, or when we're going for a walk along the towpath when we're allowed out here at Penton Hook, then we always say, when we see the violets emerging, "Oh, look, Nan, your favourite." Near the Thames Lock, which is about 100 yards away from where I live, there's a huge bank of violets which comes out every year, and it's just absolutely extraordinary. Now here, I'm talking about wild violets. These are viola, V-I-O-L-A, that self-seed freely and have purple flowers and bearded, spurred petals. They're known as the common blue violet, or sometimes the woolly blue violet, or the hooded violet, or the wood violet. Viola solaria, which is the true wild violet, is rarely seen outside ancient woodlands, but the more common, ordinary common blue violet is a regular self-seeder, and it manages to get into lawns and into wild spaces and into people's gardens. The name comes from the old French word violette, and in turn that comes from the Latin viola, which we both use to classify the flower. So the colour that we know of as violet comes from the flower and not the other way round. Do you understand what I'm saying? The first recorded use of the flower name as a colour in English came in 1370, so quite late. So up to that point, up to 1370 or around about then, they would have just used the word purple, not violet. There is some evidence to suggest that before the Roman invasion of 43 AD, and obviously long before the Norman conquest of 1066, people in England, when they saw a viola, the wood violet, obviously they couldn't call it violet or viola because they didn't know the word viola. They used the word cuckoo. And so there's some evidence to suggest that they described the flower as a cuckoo shoe or a cuckoo's heel. The flowers and the leaves of the wild violets are edible, and some folk herbalists have suggested that the roots can also be eaten. We know that the Cherokee Nation used violets to treat colds and to treat headaches. And we also know that the leaves are high in vitamins A and C, and they can be eaten raw. And the flowers, the little viola flowers, have been made into jelly and into candy. And it's probably because of the use of the flower by the Cherokee Nation that the wild violet is the state flower of Illinois, Rhode Island, New Jersey and Wisconsin. So quite a valuable little flower. The violet.